This is ancient Greece, but not the Greece of marble statues and philosophical dialogues taught in classrooms. Behind closed doors in ancient Greece lay the gynikaion, the women's quarters. Here, wives, daughters, and female slaves lived their entire lives in seclusion, hidden from all men beyond their family. As Athens debated justice in the agora and Sparta trained its warriors for honorable combat, Greek colonies spread civilization across the Mediterranean. Yet, behind this grandeur, countless women lived and died in silence. They had no property, no public voice, and no legal identity apart from their fathers, husbands, or sons. The year is 431 BCE. The Peloponnesian War has just begun, and Pericles, the great statesman whose funeral oration would define Athenian democracy for millennia, stands before the assembled citizens to honor the war dead. His speech soars with rhetoric about freedom, equality, and the glory of Athens. Then, almost as an afterthought, he addresses the widows present. "Your greatest glory is to be least talked about among men, whether in praise or blame." This was not cruelty. This was the ideal. For a respectable Greek woman, the highest achievement was invisibility. To be seen was to be shamed. To be known was to be ruined. But invisibility takes many forms. For the women of the citizen class, those married to Athens voters and property owners, invisibility meant imprisonment in comfort. They lived in houses they could not leave without permission, in rooms where sunlight entered but they could not exit. Their days were measured in the rhythmic clack of the loom, the grinding of grain, the supervision of household slaves. They were educated just enough to run a household but not enough to participate in the culture happening beyond their walls. Literacy was considered dangerous for women. Too much knowledge might give them ideas about their own worth. The gynikaion was typically located at the rear of the house, accessible only through the main rooms that men controlled. This architectural arrangement was deliberate. A woman couldn't leave without passing through male space under male observation. Windows, if they existed at all, were small and placed high, offering no view of the street, no glimpse of the polis where her husband, brothers, and sons moved freely. One Athenian writer praised a house's design specifically because its women's quarters were separated from the men's by a bolted door, so that nothing inside could be carried out improperly, and so the slaves could not have children without our permission. Slaves. The word appears casually, embedded in domestic advice, because the average Athenian household maintained several enslaved women. And here the architecture of suffering deepens, becomes more complex, because while citizen wives were gilded prisoners, enslaved women existed in a category below personhood entirely. They had no legal recourse against rape. In fact, rape of a slave woman wasn't even considered a crime. It was at most property damage, a violation of the owner's rights, not the woman's body. An enslaved woman could be sold, beaten, sexually exploited by any male in the household, and if she became pregnant, the child belonged to her master, to be kept or exposed to die as he saw fit. The exposure of infants, leaving newborns to die from exposure on hillsides or in clay pots at crossroads, was practiced throughout Greece. But female infants were abandoned at vastly higher rates. Girls were expensive liabilities, requiring dowries when they married, offering no political or military advantage to their families. One comedic playwright wrote a line that apparently resonated with audiences. "Everyone raises a son even if he is poor, but exposes a daughter even if he is rich." The line got laughs. It was repeated in multiple plays. The audience of Athenian men found truth in it, humor in it, no shame whatsoever. For those girls who survived infancy, childhood was brief and rigidly gendered. By age 7, boys were sent to school or training, entering the public world of men. Girls remained home, learning the skills that would define their worth: weaving, cooking, household management, and above all, silence. The ideal wife was described by Xenophon in his Oeconomicus, a Socratic dialogue about household management, as a 15-year-old bride who had been trained to see as little as possible, hear as little as possible, and ask as little as possible. This wasn't abuse. This was the educational ideal for respectable women. Marriage itself was not a union, but a transaction. Fathers arranged matches based on political alliances and economic advantage. The bride, often between 12 and 15 years old, had no say in the selection of her husband, who was typically twice her age or more. On her wedding night, she was transferred from her father's ownership to her husband's, moving from one gynekaion to another, from one form of confinement to the next. The marriage ceremony included a ritual where the bride was given away, using the same verb used for selling property. Ekdosis. What happened within these marriages is largely lost to history because women's voices were systematically excluded from the written record. But fragments survive, clues in unexpected places. Medical texts by Hippocratic physicians described treatments for hysteria, a condition they believed was caused by the uterus wandering through the body. The prescribed cure? Marriage and pregnancy to anchor the womb in place. But reading between the lines, these texts describe women suffering from anxiety, depression, physical pain, and emotional distress. The doctors attributed these symptoms to biology, never questioning whether confinement, forced marriage, and complete loss of autonomy might be the actual cause. One Hippocratic text discusses a young bride who became violently ill after marriage, refusing food, attempting to hang herself. The physician treats this as a medical curiosity, a disorder of the blood. He never considers that she might be reacting rationally to an intolerable situation. She was returned to health through herbal remedies and bloodletting. Then she was returned to her husband. The text notes this as a successful treatment. Childbirth was the most dangerous moment in a Greek woman's life. With no understanding of infection, no pain management beyond herbal remedies of dubious effectiveness, and midwifery practiced largely by experienced slaves or older women with no formal training, maternal mortality rates were staggering. Estimates suggest 1 in 10 births resulted in the mother's death. Grave markers across the Greek world attest to this toll. Here lies Phanostrate, wife of Socles. She died in childbirth, age 16. Here lies Xenophanta, who died bringing forth her third child, age 19. The stones are everywhere, each one marking a woman who fulfilled her social function and was killed by it. For those who survived childbirth, the danger wasn't over. Multiple pregnancies in quick succession wore bodies down. One skeletal analysis from a cemetery near Athens found that women's remains showed signs of severe osteoporosis, vitamin deficiencies, and pelvic damage consistent with repeated childbirth, all before age 30. Their bones told stories their mouths never could, of bodies used up in service of producing heirs, of lives consumed by their biological function. But the suffering extended beyond physical danger. Emotional deprivation was built into the system. A respectable wife was expected to manage her husband's household efficiently while maintaining emotional distance. Affection between spouses was considered inappropriate, almost shameful. Men sought companionship, intellectual stimulation, and erotic satisfaction outside marriage, with other men, with educated courtesans called hetairai, with enslaved women they owned. The wife was for legitimate children and household management. Nothing more. This created a peculiar form of loneliness. Confined to the gynekaion, surrounded by female slaves and children, a woman of the citizen class lived her entire life without a single conversation with a man that wasn't transactional or authoritative. Her husband gave orders. She obeyed. Male guests visited, and she disappeared further into the women's quarters, becoming invisible even within her own home. One visitor to Athens wrote with surprise that when he asked his host about his wife's health, the man looked puzzled and mildly offended, as if the question itself was improper. "She is well enough, I suppose," he said finally. "I wouldn't really know." The isolation was profound. Women's friendships provided some relief, but even these were constrained. Respectable women didn't visit each other's homes without specific occasion: funerals, religious festivals, childbirth. To be seen in public, even traveling between houses, invited scandal. One character in a Greek play defends his wife's honor by insisting, "She has not been outside the house 3 times in 4 years." This was meant as proof of her virtue. Religious festivals offered the only sanctioned escape from the gynekaion. During certain celebrations, the thesmophoria, the anthesteria, the panathenaia, women were permitted, even required, to leave their homes and participate in public rituals. For a few precious days, the invisible half of the population became visible. They processed through streets, offered sacrifices, danced, and sang. But even these moments of freedom were carefully circumscribed. The thesmophoria, Athens' most important women's festival, took place on the Pnyx, the very hill where the male assembly met to debate democracy. But during the festival, all men were banished from the area. Women's visibility was permitted only when men agreed to become invisible instead. And what of women's own voices? What did they think, feel, dream, hope for? We have tantalizing fragments. Poems by Sappho of Lesbos, who wrote of love between women with intensity that shocked and fascinated later generations. But Sappho was an exception, living on an island with different customs, and even her work survives mostly in fragments, quoted by disapproving male scholars who considered her brilliant but morally suspect. For the vast majority of Greek women, their thoughts died with them, unrecorded and unconsidered. Occasionally, male writers put words in women's mouths, creating female characters in plays and dialogues, but these were male fantasies of what women might say, filtered through assumptions about female nature. Euripides, considered the most sympathetic to women among Greek playwrights, wrote powerful speeches for Medea, Electra, and Hecuba, women in impossible situations making terrible choices. But even Euripides framed these women as creatures of excessive emotion, prone to hysteria and revenge when scorned. The Greek word for womb, hystera, became the root of hysteria, the supposed disease of ungoverned female emotion. Women's pain was medicalized, dismissed as biological malfunction rather than rational response to systematic oppression. Legal status tells its own story of erasure. In Athens, women could not own property in their own names, could not enter into contracts worth more than a medimnus of barley, roughly 3 days' food for a family, could not testify in court except in certain murder trials, and then only if no male witness was available. A woman existed legally as an eternal minor, passed from father to husband to son, always under male guardianship called kyriaia. She had no legal personality independent of the man who owned her. This meant that violence against women was prosecuted not as assault on the woman, but as property damage or insult to her male guardian. If a man raped a citizen woman, the crime was not against her, but against her father or husband, a violation of his honor and his property. The rapist might be prosecuted, but the woman had no legal standing to bring charges herself. She was simultaneously victim and evidence, but never plaintiff. Meanwhile, rape of enslaved women wasn't criminalized at all. They were property, and an owner could do as he wished with his property. Divorce was theoretically possible but practically unattainable for women. A man could divorce his wife for any reason by simply sending her back to her father's house. A woman seeking divorce had to have her father or male guardian petition on her behalf, and the grounds were extremely limited, essentially requiring proof that the husband was squandering her dowry, the only property that remained legally connected to her. The shame of divorce followed her. The practical difficulties of remarriage in a society that valued virgin brides meant that divorce often sentenced a woman to a twilight existence in her father's house, unmarried and unmarriageable, occupying a non-category that Greek society could barely conceptualize. And then there was the silent suffering that leaves no archaeological trace, no legal record, no literary reference. The depression of confinement, the grief of babies lost to exposure or death, the terror of approaching childbirth, the exhaustion of managing households and enslaved people while having no power yourself, the cognitive dissonance of teaching your son about democracy and virtue while knowing he will grow up to have rights you will never possess. One woman's gravestone, unusual in its candor, simply reads, "I suffered greatly." No explanation, just that stark acknowledgement. The Spartan exception is worth noting because it throws Athenian practices into sharp relief. In Sparta, women exercised publicly, owned property, and spoke freely, practices that scandalized other Greeks. Athenian writers described Spartan women with a mixture of fascination and horror, calling them bold, immodest, and dangerous. The implication was clear. Women with freedom were unnatural, a threat to social order. The fact that Sparta was Athens' great rival only reinforced this connection in Athenian minds. Giving women autonomy led to military state, to loss of culture and refinement. Better to keep them locked away, preserved in domestic virtue. Yet, even Sparta's relative freedom had limits. Spartan women didn't vote, didn't hold office, existed primarily to produce warrior sons. Their freedom was functional, designed to breed healthier children through exercise, not because the Spartans believed women possessed equal worth. It was still a society built on the assumption of male supremacy, just arranged slightly differently. The legacy of this suffering extends far beyond ancient Greece. For centuries, Western civilization held up Athens as the pinnacle of human achievement, the birthplace of democracy and rational thought. Philosophers from Rome to Renaissance Europe to Enlightenment, America looked to Athens as their model. They inherited not just its political innovations but its assumptions about women, that female subordination was natural, that women's confinement was necessary for social order, that democracy and women's rights were incompatible. When the American founders created their democratic republic, they consciously modeled it on Athens. They also inherited Athens' exclusions, denying women the vote, property rights, legal personhood. The connection was explicit. One anti-suffrage senator in the 19th century argued against women's voting rights by citing Greek practice. The Greeks, who understood democracy better than anyone, knew that women's place was in the home. The suffering of ancient Greek women echoed through millennia, used to justify the continued subordination of their descendants. Modern archaeology has begun recovering what ancient texts erased. Skeletal remains tell stories of childhood malnutrition suggesting female infants were fed less than male. Grave goods reveal that women were buried with weaving tools and jewelry, but men with armor and athletic prizes, gender roles imposed even in death. Chemical analysis of bones shows women's diets were less varied and nutritious than men's in the same households. The bones don't lie, even when the literature does. One artifact haunts in its ordinariness, a loom weight discovered in the ruins of an Athenian house, clay marked with the fingerprints of the woman who shaped it. We don't know her name. We never will. But her fingerprints survived 2,400 years, pressed into clay, the only physical trace that she existed. She stood in a gynaekeon very much like the one we've been describing, shaping this weight, setting up her loom, weaving cloth that has long since rotted away. Her fingerprints outlasted her name, her voice, every thought she ever had. That's the final cruelty of the ancient Greek women's world. Not just that they suffered, but that they were forgotten by design. Their suffering was structured into silence. The civilization that obsessively recorded its military victories, its philosophical debates, its athletic competitions, kept almost no record of the daily lives of half its population. They existed in a historical shadow, present but invisible, human but not quite, and yet they were there, in every house, every city, every generation. Millions of them, living and dying, loving their children, mourning their losses, finding small joys in friendships and festivals, enduring what they could not change. Their silence is not evidence they felt nothing. It's evidence their feelings were considered unworthy of record. Walk through the ruins of ancient Athens today. Stand on the Acropolis where the Parthenon still rises in its broken glory. Look down at the foundations of houses below and notice the smaller rooms at the back. The women's quarters, roofless now, exposed to the sky they never saw from within. Try to imagine the lives contained in those spaces, the voices that spoke only to each other, the dreams that died unspoken. The stones remember what the texts forgot, and in their silence they ask a question we still haven't fully answered. How many civilizations have we celebrated without counting the cost paid by those who had no choice but to be invisible?